Hey guys, it's Em. And today, it's time to boil down all my thoughts on Souten into one video. The review is finally rearing its head. And honestly, where the fuck do I even start? A main factor into why this video took so long is because of how much I didn't want to talk about this manga again. As I'm sure you heard in my series that I did a while ago when I was going through the whole story live. But here, I'm gonna give my more concise thoughts on this, in my humble opinion, mediocre piece of fiction. I've debated how I was gonna do this because doing it the same way I reviewed Ray Gaiden with me going over near every chapter would make me want to jump off of Niagara Falls, and not into the water. So instead I feel like I could explain why Souten as a whole doesn't work by just talking about its heroes and villains. The characters in Souten are about as complex as broken down cardboard. They fucking suck, and I think is a main reason reading it is such a struggle. For instance, Kazumi is probably one of the best characters. Problem is, Kazumi's not interesting. He in theory as a base concept is good. A Chinese gang member with an alter ego as a teacher who also happens to be a lighthearted, goofy guy. Could have worked, but for a majority of the story, he doesn't do anything with his teacher persona as it's dropped near it immediately after it was introduced, only coming up once or twice when he needs a disguise. So it's very easy to forget that was even part of his character. Hell, half the time I forgot he was actually meant to be smart, because he doesn't do anything outside of the box by H&K standards that would make me think anything like he has high intellect. His lighthearted contrast to H&K Ken hardly matters because other than some real hit or miss jokes, he's practically devoid of any sort of unique personality other than cigarettes. He doesn't have any super special character driven moments except for one or two extremely short ones, and in the sea of shonen characters, he comes off as just another one and not anything standout. H&K Ken wasn't exactly the bastion of unique character writing. He was stoic, quiet, but a caring dude. And funnily enough, that more subdued main character type made him stand out more in the shonen sea than this jock dude bro version of him. If you don't like Kazumi or think he's a fairly average character, he can't really bounce off of the other characters as they feel like exposition dumps. As I said, Kazumi's part of a gang. So you'd think when he gathers the gang, the book would make you grow attached to them? This doesn't fucking happen. They get one kind of interesting introduction event, and then they might as well all become Speedwagon because they won't do anything else major in the story past that point. The supporting cast never shut the fuck up about exposition when they're on screen. I remember people telling me they loved Yi and Guang, and I was wondering what the hell could have even attached you to these characters. You see, H&K had the problem of introducing these interesting characters but killing them as soon as you get invested in them. SNK introduces all these could-be interesting characters, but then just strings them along the plot as their characters grow thinner and thinner the longer the story goes. The perfect example of this is Pan Yuling. She starts off as a badass who's liberating people and fighting for what she believes in. She was the only side character that felt active in the story for a moment, and I was way more interested to see what happened with her than with Kazumi. But after the Dogwater Pan memory loss arc, she might as well have become the 40k emperor as she's nothing but a husk of her former self who hardly does anything in the story. The best side character in this story that actually felt like a character was Souten, which I will admit when he was introduced, he felt like a wet fart I didn't care about. But then the second he became actually interesting, way more interesting than everyone else in the story at this point, they killed him. Yeah, the closest the story ever got to being really interesting was immediately swept under the rug for a shitter character. Speaking of shitter characters, let's talk about the villains and how fucking awful they are. 70% of the villains here felt like Club or Spade type characters. Ugly pawn type guys that only exist to get killed by our main heroes. Except it's even worse here because a lot of them don't even have powers. It's hard for me to get invested with Crab Hand Guy or even Robot Head Guy when I know Kazumi could dig them down raw within 5 seconds of meeting them. The worst example of this is the Scar Juke lookalike they introduced. He was meant to be the main thing Zong, who we'll talk about in a sec, was chasing. This dude sucks as a villain and as a character because other than killing Zong's parents off screen, we don't have any fucking reason to care about him. Then they drag out catching him, and then when they do catch him, he gets scrambled like an egg because we all knew walking into this, he can't do shit against any of the main cast anyway. But what about the martial artist, I hear you saying? Uninteresting. To skip over the first kind of main enemy because it felt like even the story didn't care to talk about him, Main felt like a villain they threw in because the story needed one. He could have been interesting had they introduced his backstory more organically, but they crammed it all into his death. Feiyun in his brief villain period was pretty generic and when the character was at his worst. But for those of you who saw the videos of me reacting to the chapters, you know there was one villain I did like for a moment, and that was Taeyun. I liked him for how much of a piece of shit he was. He was a completely irredeemable person. He was known as the wife stealer. After an entire arc about saving Geis's sister, he immediately blows her up. He says he wants to grape Kazumi's girlfriend. He turns one of his underlings forcibly gay by altering his mind and telling him to attract the ugliest man he can find while acting like a whore. This was the most unlikable character in SNK and probably HNK. But somehow, they ruined this by giving this character a fucking redemption arc. out of literally anybody in this story. This guy? Fucking seriously? And then they have the nerve to show him again later in the story as this calm and collected friend of the group when he never earned this. To be frank, there isn't much you can do to come back from what he did, but they made him disappear for a majority of the story. Then he randomly appears a few arcs later, and then he appears again at the literal ending of the story. He's the most egregious example of this story's shitty character writing, and the common trend that Cosby wants to spare literally every fucking character for no reason. Seriously, if you see anyone with any sort of unique design, no matter what their crimes are in this story, Kazumi will spare them. They could probably murder babies right in front of Kazumi and he'd go, but maybe once they had a good heart. Maybe they did this to make Kazumi different from Ken, who killed everyone that he fought in his story. But if that's what they were attempting at, it makes Kazumi seem like low-key a lunatic, trying to redeem himself for his mafia days by sparing any somewhat attractive man he runs into, seeing as he kills all the ugly little shitty side villains the story has. The literal only example for a main villain with a unique design dying was Mang, and even then, Kazumi didn't fucking do that. It's miserable watching this shittier version of Fairy Tail where everyone's pals despite their differences, which in this case include manslaughter and grape. Even in the final showdown between Heaven and Earth in Soryu Tenra, the fucking holy spirit of the plot intervenes, stopping Kazumi from getting one main kill in this story, going, no, you can't do that. This is secretly a children's book. And you may be thinking, damn, I think you forgot to go more into two major characters. No, I saved Zong and his little shit-strained Yasuka for last. Let's start with Zong, seeing as he was meant to be the ultimate badass antagonist of this story. He sucks ass. He barely feels like an end manga fight, and more of a guy who was there because the plot needed another villain. Let's start with his introduction. Zong was introduced sparing Hitler when he was sent to kill him in his sleep. As a nihilist, he doesn't care what happens to the world. This is admittedly pretty bad. From here and with this characterization, he could have gone on to terrorize anyone who got in the way of his work, or just been coldly murdering or attacking Kazumi's friends. But this doesn't happen. He visits Geis's grave, Kazumi pulls a reverse Uno card out of his ass, then the story forgot he was meant to be a villain. As I mentioned earlier, we then spend a good chunk of the story chasing after this powerless Scarface guy. We waste 30 or so chapters, then after that, Yasuka arrives, and everyone ends up being buddy-buddy until this arc concludes with Feiyun's death, not at the hands of Zong, by the way. Then we ramble about Hokuto Shinken and Hokuto Ryukin lore, then the two fight. Now, did you notice something interesting in my description of this character's story? I didn't name any villainous acts outside of the first fucking one. I 190% do not care about the story hyping us up to fight this guy because he hasn't done shit to our cast for me to care. Do you know why Rao worked? Because we knew from his introduction that this dude would be a problem. His influence was felt throughout the entire show at that point, and we knew he had to be stopped or else our characters would die and the wasteland as a whole would suffer a cold fate. He almost killed and did kill multiple characters in the story we grew to love. We as readers have multiple reasons to be invested in his downfall, and all this isn't including the fact that he's pretty interesting as a character in himself. Do you know why Kaio worked? He was insane. Again, we knew if Ken failed to stop him, the wasteland would be fucked, maybe even more so than if Rao won due to how unstable he was. And again, he killed multiple members of our cast, damn near beat Ken to death, and we had plenty of reasons to want to see his end. Now that brings us back to Zong. What the fuck did he do? He didn't kill anyone in the main cast. He doesn't have any bigger ambitions that would cause the world to fall into peril, especially so after becoming a monk. Why the fuck should we care what happens to this guy? He's not even an active evil presence like the other two. Sometimes I forgot he existed. His one sparing Hitler scene felt so removed from the plot and like such a random thing to do, it's hard to even take seriously. The literal worst thing he does that we'd have any investment in is roughing up Kazumi a bit. So you know what's worse than making a forgettable villain? Making me wonder why the fuck he's a villain in the first place. Honestly, he feels like a bit of a dick, but not an active threat. I feel like this is the main reason that they had to throw the whole Hokuto Ryukin and Hokuto Shinken aspect into it, because I didn't even get the vibe that these two even really disliked each other. And that feeling really hit me when they sat down and shared that drink right before the final fight. Honestly, people telling me to read this story hyped him up more than the damn writer himself. Now, let's talk about the sloppy seconds Yasuka. Yasuka isn't even the crust of the story. He's more like the crumbs. And for some reason, someone really fucking cared about those crumbs. His first introduction where he injures Zong off screen and kills Feiyun are probably his best moments as a villain. Shit, even those things alone by themselves give us the readers more reasons to hate him than Zong. But after that, there's like 40 damn chapters of him doing jack shit. Then when he finally decides to reappear, it's at the end of the damn story where everyone can ragdoll him. This is made blatantly obvious when Zong straight bitches him and Taeyun, goddamn chapter 50 or something, Taeyun steps to him. He hardly feels like a threat at this point. And I want you to remember, this is damn near at the climax of the story. Zong and Kazumi are fighting in a pocket dimension right now. When that fight ends, you'd expect the story to end, right? After all, this is what the plot was building towards. Although it felt like the most boring padding ever, it's obvious that this is what the conclusion of the story was meant to be. But no, the writers went, ah, fuck, we forgot about Yasuka. So the last set of chapters is a lore dump trying to wrap up his character and arc. Now, if Yasuka and Zong were hyped up separately in entirely different arcs, this probably wouldn't even have been a problem. Yasuka could have got his story first, then we could have hard focused on Zong. But by trying to take their shit and flesh it too, both of the characters ended up floating in this null space until they were needed. So by the point they expected us to care about Yasuka again, he was pretty much outdated like an LR unit. Now what about him as a character? Does he have any depth? No! Allow me to summarize Yasuka's whole character right now.
The Lord wanted you gone, and by the Lord's word, Lord, have you in this blood and Lord of the arms before you can even say amen.
That's gotta be blasphemy. Anyway, he's probably the most egregious example of flat characters in this entire story, to the point where they needed to make Regenesis a completely separate book to make him seem like kind of a real character. With everyone else, outside of good and evil, there's also the old towers. Alright, as we call it in the business, the writer not knowing how the fuck to advance the plot, so we made a character to tell Kazumi what to do. I hate this little goblin because you know the second he shows up, he's only there to give Kazumi a map marker of what to do next. And they hardly even tried to make him his own character, so other than plot convenience, he has no other purpose. So a majority of the good guys are boring, the villains are shitty. What about the main plot? The plot feels like a fever dream happening. It's an unfocused mess. In base HNK, the main focus only shifts like twice. It's save Yuria and stop Rao. Things are happening along the way, obviously, but it was crystal clear that's what the overarching plot was about at all times, and everything moved towards that goal. In SNK, my eyes kept glazing over to keep up because it felt like the main plot was bombarding me with different things damn near every other chapter, and none of them felt interesting. If I were to attempt to summarize the two main events in this story, it would be to form the gang and then stop Zong. But I hardly cared about the game because, like I said, they were shittily written past introduction, and I didn't care about Zong because I didn't see him as a huge threat in the world. So if you can't get me invested in the main plot, what hope does the rest of the story have? None! And that's the fucked up part. I can't even think of any other story where I gave less of a shit about any of the characters in it. I could probably scrub these characters' faces out and replace them with literally anybody else, and nothing would really change. Kazumi could be any hero. Yulin could be any generic MC girlfriend. Zong could literally be any other villain. Honestly, that might even make him better. And nothing would really change. Nothing deeper than surface level happens here. It's not like HNK where I'd want to see guidance and get side material to flesh out these intriguing characters. It's a bunch of puppets that only exist to move the story along, and that's it. In HNK, we have fans of damn near every character. People who enjoy their philosophies or worldviews. Rao, for example, has tons of fans. People trying to see the underlying points of his character. The subtleties of him not being a flat-out monster. The fact that the final fight can be turned into what's better for the wasteland. An iron fist or a calm hand. Not a single character in SNK once made me think like that. And honestly, I don't even know if it's possible for that here. And in comparison to not even HNK but anime in general, as I said near the start, this shit doesn't stand out. And at worst, it's a waste of time. So let's wrap up. I don't like the story. It's a jumbled mess of events with fumbled payoffs that feel like someone trying to edge you but they can't even turn you on. I would never read this story again. At least with Garuda Gaiden or shit. By comparison, even Ray Gaiden, they had the courtesy of being shorter, or at least way shorter than this shit that will take up an entire month of your time that leaves you with literally no emotional reaction at all after 200 or something chapters. If I had to look at this and try to give it any sort of rating at all that isn't a 1, maybe a 3. They play around with some interesting ideas once every 50 chapters, the art's really good, but there is literally nothing else redeeming about this story at all. Maybe we lucked into a good story the first time with HNK, because this just isn't it. Anyways, I feel I've said my piece. As always, I'm glad to discuss with you guys in the comments, and I've been in, and I am out.